My father secretly cut me out of his will, and I only found out at the worst possible time. I was in the middle of planning my wedding when everything started to go downhill. My fiancée, Sarah, and I were finalizing guest lists, sorting through flower arrangements, and juggling all the little details that come with planning such a huge event. It was stressful, but the good kind of stress, the type that made me feel like my life was moving forward. We were making plans for the future, buying a house together, and even discussing having kids someday. The wedding itself was going to be expensive, but I wasn't too worried. My father, a successful businessman, had always assured me that I would be well taken care of when the time came. I never doubted him. My relationship with my dad wasn't perfect, but we were close. He had always been a bit of a tough character, strict, traditional, and not one to shower affection. Growing up, we had our disagreements, especially when I decided not to follow in his footsteps and pursue my own career instead of joining the family business. But those were just typical father-son spats. We still talked often, and I never thought our differences would run deep enough to cause any real friction. The thought that anything could be wrong between us never crossed my mind. The rest of the family dynamic was complicated, to say the least. My dad had remarried a few years after my mom passed away, and my stepmother, Joan, was a bit of a wild card. She was always polite, but there was something about her that felt distant, as if she wasn't really interested in being part of our family. Then there were my step-siblings, Peter and Chloe. We didn't exactly click, but I wouldn't say we were hostile either. Our interactions were always cordial but detached, like three strangers forced to sit at the same dinner table out of obligation, rather than any real connection. I didn't pay much attention to them, to be honest. My dad had always made it clear that I was his son, his blood, and nothing could change that. At the time, my dad had started showing signs of aging, more than I wanted to admit. He'd had a few health scares in the past year, nothing too serious, but enough that Sarah and I began to talk about estate planning. You know, the kind of conversation every couple has when they're planning their future together. She was cautious, asking if I had checked everything regarding the will, especially with my dad's health starting to decline. I wasn't worried. I knew I was covered. I had heard my dad talk about the will before, and I had no reason to think anything had changed. Still, for peace of mind, I decided to double check. I called our family lawyer, Mr. Watkins, a man who had handled my father's legal affairs for years. It wasn't a big deal in my mind, just a formality. We set up a meeting to go over everything. Sarah insisted on joining me, just to be thorough. The conversation started off as expected. Mr. Watkins was his usual professional self, pulling out documents and going over the estate details. We talked about assets, properties, and all the things that would one day pass down to me, or so I thought. Then, as he flipped through some papers, I noticed something odd. He paused for a moment, his brow furrowing, before carefully setting the documents on the table in front of us. "I'm not sure how to say this," he began, a hint of hesitation in his voice. "But your name, it's not listed in the most recent version of your father's will." At first, I thought I'd misheard him. That didn't make any sense. My father had always been clear that everything would be left to me. It had been understood for as long as I could remember. My heart started racing, and I asked him to explain. "It seems your father revised the will a few months ago," Mr. Watkins continued, flipping the document around so I could see for myself. Sure enough, my name was nowhere to be found. Instead, everything, his assets, the family home, and even the business, was designated to my step-siblings and Joan. I sat there in stunned silence. I could feel Sarah's eyes on me, but I couldn't look at her. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of it. This had to be some kind of mistake, right? Maybe the lawyer had grabbed the wrong file, or maybe my dad hadn't reviewed this revision properly. But when I asked Mr. Watkins if this was a mistake, he shook his head. "I've double-checked it," he said. "This is the final, legally binding version of the will, and your father signed it himself." I didn't know what to say. It felt like the ground had been pulled out from under me. Why would my father do this? We had never had a falling out that would explain something this drastic. Sure, we had our differences, but nothing serious enough to justify cutting me out of his will completely. I left the lawyer's office with more questions than answers. My thoughts were spinning in 1,000 different directions. Why hadn't my dad told me about this? What could have happened to make him change his mind like this? And why had Joan and my step-siblings suddenly been pushed to the front? None of it added up. I hadn't confronted my dad yet. I wasn't sure if I was ready for that conversation. What if he didn't even know? Or worse, what if he did know and just didn't care? I needed to figure out more before I went to him directly. But one thing was clear. Something was seriously wrong, and I had no idea why this was happening. I could feel the tension building, but I wasn't ready to face it head on. Not yet. All I knew was that this revelation had completely shattered the foundation of what I thought I knew about my family, and I wasn't sure how to move forward. Something was going on behind the scenes, and I was determined to find out what. I couldn't wait any longer. After sitting on the discovery that I'd been cut out of the will, I had to confront Mr. Watkins again. Something just didn't add up. I set up a meeting with him, not wanting to leave any stone unturned. I needed clarity. I walked into his office, still in disbelief over what he had shown me last time. This time, I needed him to spell it out in detail. I sat down, and before I could even start asking questions, Mr. Watkins seemed to already know what I was about to ask. "The will was revised a few months ago," he said, as if anticipating my thoughts. He pulled out the same stack of documents he'd shown me earlier and handed them over. "This is your father's final version." The change was deliberate. It wasn't a mistake. I scanned the papers again, trying to find some loophole, some inconsistency, but there was none. Everything seemed legit. His assets, everything from the family home to the business, had been left to Joan, Peter, and Chloe. I wasn't in it. I felt a rush of confusion, but I stayed silent as he continued. "Your father came to me personally, and this is the version he signed. He made the decision to leave the estate to Joan and the others." The finality in his voice hit hard. It wasn't some clerical error. It was real. My father had done this on purpose. Leaving Mr. Watkins' office, I knew what I had to do next. I needed to talk to my dad directly. Maybe there was a reasonable explanation, or maybe he didn't fully understand what he'd signed. He wasn't as sharp as he used to be, and with his health slipping, maybe someone had convinced him to make a decision he wouldn't have made otherwise. I called him, but the conversation felt off from the start. He sounded distracted, not his usual self. Every question I asked about the will was met with vague responses, as if he didn't know or didn't want to talk about it. He kept brushing off the topic, saying things like, "We'll talk later," or "I'm too tired to discuss that now." I pushed for more, but eventually he made an excuse to end the call. It wasn't like him to avoid important conversations, especially something as serious as this, and the fact that he couldn't even give me a straight answer only made me more suspicious. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone else was involved in this. Someone was keeping him from telling me the truth. I decided to drop by the house the next day to try and talk to him face to face. When I got there, Joan answered the door, her expression a little too surprised to see me. She mentioned that my dad wasn't feeling well and that it wasn't the best time for a visit. That in itself wasn't unusual. His health had been up and down lately, but the way she blocked me from even seeing him raised my suspicions. Joan had never been overly warm toward me, but this felt different. It felt like she was deliberately trying to keep me away. I stayed polite, didn't push too hard, but made it clear that I needed to see him soon. She gave a tight smile and said she'd let me know when he was feeling better. I left, but the feeling in my gut told me something wasn't right. Over the next week, I started noticing more strange behavior from the rest of the family. Peter and Chloe usually didn't bother much with family affairs, suddenly seemed more involved. They were showing up at my dad's house more often than usual, and anytime I tried to get information about my dad's health or his decision about the will, they gave me the same vague answers as Joan. I was getting stonewalled, and it was starting to feel deliberate. Something clicked when I overheard a conversation between Peter and one of our family friends at a party a few days later. Peter mentioned offhandedly that my dad had been making some poor decisions lately, but nothing specific. The way he said it, though, didn't sit right with me. It wasn't a simple comment. It felt like a piece of something bigger. I started thinking about my dad's recent behavior. Over the last year or so, he'd been acting differently, more withdrawn, less confident in making decisions. I had chalked it up to aging, but now I wasn't so sure. Maybe there was more to it. Maybe he was under pressure or worse, being manipulated by someone close to him. I reached out to a few extended family members and some of his old business partners, trying to piece together what was really going on. What I heard painted a troubling picture. One of his old business partners told me that my dad had been under a lot of stress recently, more than I realized. Apparently, there had been some tension within the family, particularly around finances. He hinted that Joan and Peter had been pushing him to make changes in the business, changes he wasn't entirely comfortable with. The more I dug, the more uneasy I became. It seemed like Joan and Peter had been influencing my dad for a while now, slowly getting more involved in his personal and business affairs. I started to wonder if they had played a role in the will being revised. It wasn't a stretch to think that they could have coerced him into changing it while he was vulnerable. Just when I thought things couldn't get more complicated, I received a message late one night. It was from an unknown number, but the message was clear. There's more going on than you know. If you want to find the truth, you need to dig deeper. I sat there, staring at the message, my mind racing. Who sent it? And what exactly was I missing? One thing was certain, this wasn't just about a will anymore. Something much bigger was at play, and if I didn't figure it out soon, I'd never get to the bottom of it. The unraveling had only just begun. The message from the unknown number had been nagging at me for days. There's more going on than you know. If you want to find the truth, you need to dig deeper. It played over and over in my head, pushing me to take action. I couldn't let it slide, so I decided it was time to confront the people I suspected were behind all this. Joan, Peter, and Chloe. It wasn't just about the will anymore. Something deeper was at play, and I needed answers. I headed over to my father's house one evening, determined to get some clarity. Joan answered the door, as usual, and I didn't waste time with pleasantries. I asked to speak with her and Peter directly. She looked surprised, but invited me in. Peter joined us in the living room shortly after, looking just as caught off guard. I brought up the will. Calm at first, I asked why it had been changed and why I had been completely cut out. They exchanged glances, trying to downplay the situation. Joan, in her usual calm and collected way, told me that my father had made the decision for his own reasons and that I should respect his wishes. Peter nodded along, almost too eagerly, as if he had rehearsed this, but I wasn't buying it. I pressed harder, pointing out how strange it was that my father had never mentioned any of this to me and how evasive he had been during our recent conversations. The room grew tense. Joan's calm demeanor started to crack. She insisted that I was overreacting, but there was something in her voice that gave her away. It was like she was trying too hard to sound reasonable. Peter, meanwhile, grew defensive, telling me that I wasn't entitled to anything just because I was my father's son. The comment hit hard, not because of what he said, but because it was clear this had been their plan for a while. The conversation turned heated. Peter made a few passive-aggressive comments about how I had never been involved in the family business and how I had distanced myself from my father over the years. Old family tensions surfaced, things I thought had been buried long ago. Joan even threw in a remark about how my father had always found it difficult to rely on me. It became obvious that this wasn't a new development. They had been planning this for a while, maybe even working together to influence my father when he was most vulnerable. I left that night more convinced than ever that something wasn't right. Their reactions weren't just defensive, they were strategic. They had clearly orchestrated this situation to benefit themselves, but I didn't have any hard evidence yet. That changed a few days later. I started going through some old family documents I had stored away, hoping to find anything that might shed light on the situation. As I sifted through papers, I came across a letter tucked away in an old envelope. It was dated a few months before the will had been revised, and it was from Joan to Peter. The contents of the letter weren't just shocking, they were incriminating. In the letter, Joan outlined plans to secure the estate for her side of the family, suggesting they take advantage of your father's declining health to make sure the assets were transferred. She mentioned conversations about persuading him to change the will and hinted at ways to subtly undermine his confidence in me, using past disagreements as leverage. The tone of the letter was cold, calculated, as if they were talking about a business deal rather than family. I sat back, stunned. It was worse than I had thought. This wasn't just about them taking advantage of a situation. They had actively plotted to manipulate my father and cut me out. This letter was the first piece of real proof that they had been scheming behind my back. Around the same time, my father's health took a sharp turn for the worse. He had always been a strong man, but age and stress had started to catch up to him. I was called to a family meeting at the house. Joan had organized it, and I knew immediately that something was off. When I arrived, the mood was somber. My father sat in his chair, looking frailer than I'd ever seen him. Peter and Chloe hovered around him, taking control of the conversation, while Joan played the role of the concerned wife. It became clear how much influence they had over him now. He barely spoke, and when he did, his words seemed rehearsed, like he wasn't fully in control of what he was saying. It was painful to watch. Every time I tried to speak directly to him, Joan or Peter would jump in, deflecting the conversation, steering it in another direction. I was being shut out. I knew I couldn't fight this on my own anymore. I needed professional help to get to the bottom of what was really going on. I decided to hire a private investigator. If Joan and Peter had gone this far, there was no telling what else they had done. The investigator started digging into the circumstances surrounding the will revision and my father's recent behavior. I needed to know if there was more to this than just the letter I had found. Weeks passed, and then the investigator came back with some preliminary findings. There were irregularities in my father's recent medical records. Several reports had been altered to make it seem like he was mentally sharper than he actually was at the time of the will revision. There were also discrepancies in the dates of certain meetings between my father and the family lawyer, meetings that seemed to have been orchestrated by Joan and Peter, with my father showing up only at their insistence. The investigator couldn't pinpoint who was behind everything just yet, but the trail was leading closer to Joan and Peter. It was clear they had been manipulating the situation for months, if not longer. And now, with my father's health deteriorating even further, I didn't have much time to act. I was getting closer to the truth, but I knew I needed more concrete evidence before confronting them again. I had to tread carefully. This was a family battle, but it was also becoming a legal one, and I couldn't afford to make a wrong move. The investigator promised to keep digging, but the deeper we went, the murkier everything became. And as much as I wanted to confront Joan and Peter with what I had, I wasn't ready yet, not without more proof. But I knew one thing for sure. The people I thought I could trust were at the center of this, and I was only scratching the surface of their deception. After weeks of trying, I finally found a way to get some time alone with my father. His health had been declining rapidly, but I knew that if I didn't speak to him soon, I might never get the chance. Joan and Peter had been controlling access to him, always with an excuse. He's too tired, or the doctors say he needs rest, but I couldn't wait anymore. I arrived at the house one morning much earlier than usual. Joan wasn't around, and neither were Peter or Chloe. The house was eerily quiet. I found my father sitting in his favorite chair in the living room, looking out the window. He looked frail, more so than I remembered. His skin had paled, and the once vibrant, commanding presence was now reduced to a tired, broken man. I sat down next to him, and after a few moments of small talk, I brought up the will. I didn't want to upset him, but I had to know why he had made such a drastic decision. At first, he tried to avoid the conversation, just like he had on the phone, but I kept pushing gently, and eventually, he started talking. "It was Joan," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "She convinced me that you didn't need it. She said you'd be fine on your own, that you didn't want to be tied to the family." I was stunned. Joan had told him that I didn't need my inheritance, that I didn't want to be tied to the family? It didn't make any sense. She said Peter and Chloe needed it more, that they'd help take care of things when I was gone. He paused, and I could see the regret in his eyes. I didn't know what to think. I was confused, and well, she made it sound like you had moved on, that you didn't want the responsibility. It became clear that Joan had been feeding him lies, manipulating him when he was most vulnerable. I asked him why he hadn't come to me directly, and he sighed deeply. I was sick. My memory wasn't what it used to be, and Joan, she was always there. She said she was protecting me from stress, handling things for me. I trusted her. The conversation was heartbreaking. My own father had been convinced by Joan that I didn't deserve the inheritance, that I wouldn't be able to handle it. And all the while, Peter and Chloe had been circling like vultures, waiting for their share of the spoils. I realized then that Joan had orchestrated the entire thing. She had preyed on my father's declining health, slowly isolating him from me and convincing him that her and her children were the ones who should benefit from his estate. My father had been manipulated into changing the will, and he had no idea how deeply he'd been deceived. Armed with this new information, I contacted the private investigator I had hired. We needed to dig deeper into Joan's role, and I had a feeling we'd find more than just subtle manipulation. Sure enough, the investigator found damning evidence. Several of my father's medical records had been altered, falsified reports that made it seem like he was of sound mind when he revised the will. But the reality was that his cognitive decline had been much more severe than anyone had been led to believe, especially at the time of the will's revision. Even more shocking, we uncovered a recorded conversation between Joan and Mr. Watkins, the family lawyer. In the recording, Joan had clearly pressured him to move forward with the will revision, despite concerns that my father wasn't in the right state of mind. She insisted that it was what my father wanted and that they needed to protect the family assets. It was undeniable proof of undue influence. Joan had manipulated the entire situation, preying on my father's declining health and taking advantage of his trust. She had orchestrated the revision of the will, making sure that her children would inherit everything, while I was left with nothing. With this evidence in hand, I knew we had a solid case to challenge the will. My lawyer was confident that we could prove my father had been unduly influenced and that the changes to the will were the result of coercion and manipulation. We prepared to move forward with the legal challenge, and it felt like we were finally on the verge of exposing the truth. But just as we were about to file the case, things took a darker turn. One evening, as I was going over some final paperwork with my lawyer, I received a call from an unknown number. When I answered, there was silence on the other end for a few seconds, and then a voice I recognized all too well. "You don't know what you're getting into," Joan said, her voice low and threatening. "If you keep pushing this, you'll regret it. Just let it go, or things will get worse for you." I hung up, my heart racing. Joan had never been this direct before. She must have known we were getting close to exposing her, and now she was trying to scare me off. But it wasn't going to work. If anything, her threat only made me more determined to move forward. The next day, I discovered that several important documents related to my father's estate had mysteriously gone missing. Files that we needed to prove our case had disappeared from his office. It was clear that Joan or someone working with her had taken them in an attempt to cover their tracks. The stakes had been raised, and I knew I had to be more careful. We moved quickly to secure what evidence we had left, making sure nothing else could be tampered with. My lawyer advised me to be cautious, as it was clear Joan was getting desperate. But no matter how hard she tried to block us, I wasn't going to back down. The legal battle was just beginning, and with the evidence we had gathered, I felt confident that we could expose the truth. Joan had manipulated my father, lied to him, and altered his medical records to suit her agenda. Now, it was time for her to face the consequences, but I couldn't shake the feeling that there were still more secrets lurking beneath the surface, secrets that could change everything once again. The legal battle began in full force. My lawyer filed the case to contest the will, laying out the evidence of manipulation, the falsified medical records, and the coercion that Joan and her children had exerted over my father. We had everything lined up: witness testimonies, expert opinions, and the damning recorded conversation between Joan and Mr. Watkins. It felt like we had a strong case, but I knew it wouldn't be easy. Joan wasn't going to back down without a fight. Almost immediately, Joan and her lawyer started playing dirty. They framed me as the greedy, ungrateful son who had distanced himself from his father for years and only showed up when there was money involved. They painted a picture of me as someone who was trying to steal the estate from Joan and her children, who had been there for my father during his declining health. It was a complete distortion of the truth, but I could see how they were trying to manipulate the narrative. It wasn't just about the legal facts anymore, it was about perception, and Joan was very good at controlling the story. In the weeks leading up to the hearing, Joan and her lawyer leaked misleading information to family members and even tried to circulate rumors in the community. Suddenly, I was being bombarded with accusations from distant relatives and old family friends, people who had no idea what was really going on. They accused me of being disrespectful to my father's memory, of trying to destroy the family for my own gain. It was infuriating, but I had no choice but to stay focused on the facts. The day of the hearing arrived, and the tension was palpable. My father had become too ill to attend, but the court had arranged for a video deposition from him, something that could still play a key role in the case. Joan sat confidently across from me, flanked by Peter and Chloe, who were now fully invested in protecting their cut of the estate. They avoided eye contact, and their smug expressions told me they were confident they could win this. As the hearing progressed, my lawyer laid out our evidence piece by piece. The altered medical records were the first big blow. We showed how my father's health had been misrepresented at the time of the will's revision, proving that he was not of sound mind when he made the decision. Then we presented the recording of Joan pressuring Mr. Watkins to move forward with the changes despite his concerns. The judge listened carefully, and I could see Joan shifting uncomfortably for the first time. She knew the recording was damaging. When it was Joan's turn, her lawyer attempted to dismantle our case. They focused heavily on my past, dredging up old family disagreements and trying to paint me as estranged from my father, framing the will revision as something my father had done out of disappointment with me. But it wasn't sticking. The evidence we had presented was too strong to ignore. Then came the moment that changed everything. My father's video deposition played in court. He was weak, his voice barely audible, but his words were clear. He admitted to feeling confused and pressured at the time of the will revision. He spoke about how Joan had been in his ear, convincing him that I didn't need the inheritance and that Peter and Chloe would handle things better. He didn't outright accuse Joan of manipulation, but it was enough. His frailty, his hesitation, and the regret in his voice said it all. It was a devastating moment for me. Seeing my father like that, broken, unsure, and admitting that he had been influenced, hit me hard. But it also strengthened my resolve. This wasn't just about the money or the estate anymore. It was about righting a wrong that had been done to him, to me, and to our family. As the hearing came to a close, the judge reviewed all the evidence and adjourned for a final decision. The waiting was excruciating, but in the end, the ruling came down in my favor. The will was deemed invalid due to undue influence and coercion, and the estate would revert to its original version, with my rightful share restored. I should have felt victorious, but the win was bittersweet. The legal battle had torn apart what little remained of my family. Joan and Peter left the courtroom in silence, their smug confidence shattered, but they didn't look defeated, they looked angry. I knew this wasn't over for them, at least emotionally. The truth had come out, but the damage had already been done. The family would never be the same again. In the days that followed, my father's condition worsened. He passed away quietly, without much fanfare. There were no grand gestures of reconciliation or redemption. In his final moments, I knew he was at peace, but the weight of what had happened still hung over me. He had been a victim of manipulation, but he had also played a role in letting it happen. I had won the estate, but I had lost so much more in the process. Joan and her children quickly distanced themselves after my father's death. They refused to attend the funeral, and I knew that our paths would likely never cross again. The inheritance that I had fought so hard for suddenly felt hollow. What was the point of all of this if it had cost me my family? The house, the business, the money, it all felt meaningless compared to the emotional toll that the fight had taken. As I stood in the now empty family home, the place where so many memories had been made, I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't the end of the story. There had been whispers throughout the legal battle, little hints from some of my father's old business partners, even from distant relatives, that Joan hadn't been acting alone. There were suggestions of deeper schemes involving the family business, hidden accounts, and even more secrets buried within the estate. It was like peeling back layers of an onion. Every time I thought I'd reached the core, there was something else waiting to be uncovered. In the end, I had won the legal battle, but it didn't feel like a victory. The cost had been too high. And as I prepared to move on with my life, I couldn't help but wonder, what else had been hidden from me all these years? The inheritance I had fought for wasn't the prize I thought it would be, and the family I had once known was gone forever. But something told me that the story wasn't over yet. There were still more secrets to uncover, and I wasn't sure if I was ready for what I might find.